Welcome to episode 134 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's March 14, 1948, and today's story is about a competition that happened only once and still changed South American football forever. Because on this day in 1948, Vasco da Gama drew 0-0 with River Plate in Santiago de Chile, and with that result secured first place in the South American Championship of Champions, the tournament which we now think of as the precursor to the Copa Libertadores. It was a single round robin, staged in one city, in one stadium, over just over a month, bringing together 7 of the strongest clubs in South America. And that matters, because what South America was doing here in early 1948 was testing a continental idea at club level. And that is why this matters so much. Not because Libertadores was born that night. It wasn't. 12 years still lay ahead. But because the proof of concept was there. And once all of that had been shown in public, the idea could never quite be put back in the box. But how did we get here? To understand 1948 in Santiago, we need to widen the lens. As we touched upon in episodes 44 and 83, Latin America was not untouched by World War II, but in football terms, it was far less broken than in Europe. Leagues kept running, crowds kept coming, players kept playing. The institutional life of the game kept moving. So while Europe spent the 1940s recovering, improvising, and waiting for international structures to normalize again, South American football had room to grow, to organize, and to imagine. And that timing matters. By early 1948, the post-war world was reopening. The London Olympics were only months away. The 1950 World Cup, the first after the wartime interruption, was on the horizon. Travel and communication were still far from easy, but they were improving, and South America already had a strong precedent for thinking beyond borders. National teams had been contesting continental championships since 1916. River and Nacional had already helped sustain the old Rio de la Plata club tradition through competitions like the Copa Aldao. So the leap from cross-border club prestige to a true South American championship tournament was not madness. It was the next logical ambition. The key push came from Chile. Colo-Colo, champions of Chile in 1947, organized the event in Santiago with the backing of CONMEBOL president Luis Valenzuela. The tournament brought together 7 teams representing 7 countries. And the format was simple, severe, and exhausting. One stadium, one round robin, one table, everybody against everybody. It was elegant, but it was also impractical. 21 matches in a compressed window, all in Santiago, all asking clubs to stay away from home for weeks. As a one-off festival of football, it worked brilliantly. As an annual model for a growing continent, it was too heavy. And that is one of the reasons it was never repeated in that exact form. The teams themselves tell you how ambitious the idea was. Colo-Colo were there as hosts and Chilean champions. River Plate arrived as Argentina's 1947 champions, carrying the aura of La Máquina and the presence of 21-year-old Alfredo Di Stefano. Nacional came as champions of Uruguay, and Vasco represented Rio de Janeiro as 1947 Carioca champions, which in that era was enough to carry enormous weight in Brazilian football. Litoral came from Bolivia, Municipal represented Peru as a national runners-up, and Emelec came from Ecuador. And then, in that list is also one of the long arcs of the story. Most of the grand names in this tournament, River, Nacional, Colo-Colo, and Vasco, are still among the heavyweights of South American football now. That continuity is striking. This tournament sits so early in the continental club story, and yet so many of its central institutions still dominate the landscape. Then there were the players. River brought prestige and magnetism. José Manuel Moreno, Ángel Labruna, Félix Lustó, Néstor Rossi, and Di Stefano. Not yet the myth he would become in Bogotá and Madrid, as well as world football, but already impossible to ignore. Vasco arrived with what Brazil called the Expresso da Vitória, the Victory Express. Barbosa in goal, Augusto and Wilson, Danilo, Jorge, Jalma, Manesha, Friasha, Ismael, and Chico, and above all the attacking line that made this side so feared, so fluid, and so modern. And that word matters here, modern. Because one of the things the 1948 tournament showed was that South American football was not some colorful sideshow to the real story elsewhere. These were serious teams, serious institutions, and serious tactical identities, and that mattered not only within South America, but to how the continent would be viewed from outside it. The tournament began on February 11 and unfolded through Santiago as a kind of month-long football congress. Crowds were huge. The average attendance was close to 40,000 per game. The gross gate receipts were enormous. And on the field, the football was good enough to match the idea. Vasco opened by beating Litoral 2-1. Then came the result that told everyone they were real contenders. A 4-1 win over Nacional. They beat Municipal 4-0. They beat Emelec 1-0. And they drew 1-1 with Colo Colo. And then came the final turn toward March 14. There was even an old word in the regulations. A substituted player could return to the field. That sounds almost surreal now, but it belonged to an era when international club football was still experimenting, still flexible, and still a little improvised. And this reminds us that it was not Libertadores in finished form. It was a laboratory before Libertadores. By the time Vasco played River Plate on March 14, the table had narrowed to story. River had already lost 3-0 to Nacional. That meant the Argentines needed to beat Vasco to keep control of the title race. Vasco, by contrast, needed only a draw. So the tournament had given itself the perfect final act. Brazil against Argentina, Vasco against River, the Expreso da Vitória against La Máquina. The prize, not a knockout trophy list, but supremacy in the first continental league table of champions. And then the match itself gave us something else. Tension instead of spectacle. No goals. Final score 0-0. But this was not a dead match. It was a bruising, political, emotionally charged contest. River had the stars, but Vasco had the discipline. The atmosphere in Santiago was intense. Almost 60,000 people. The officiating was contested. Both sides finished with 10 men after late expulsions. And what survived in Brazilian memory, especially, was not just the point, but the sense that Vasco had held their nerve under pressure, resisted River's class, and completed something no Brazilian club had done before: win a major international title outside Brazil. And that's the key sporting factor of March 14. Not that Vasco dazzled in their decider. They didn't need to. They did what champions in table competitions often have to do. They managed the match. That mattered most. And because River could still not catch them after the draw, Vasco were champions. 3 days later, the tournament would formally conclude, but the title had already found its owner on this day. So what did this change? It proved the continental club idea. That may sound obvious now in the age of Libertadores, Sudamericana, Champions League, Club World Cup, and endless intercontinental travel. But in 1948, that was far from obvious. A continent-wide champions tournament was expensive, logistically difficult, and politically delicate. The 1948 championship showed it could be done, and that people would care. Because the crowds came, and the press followed it. The clubs took it seriously, and the football justified the effort. Plus, the tournament widened football's map of prestige. South America already knew its clubs were strong, but this tournament put that strength into a single comparative framework. It let River be measured against Vasco, Vasco against Nacional, Colo Colo against River, all inside one event. That is how continental competition changes football history. It turns reputation into evidence. Also, it helps shape what came next, both in South America and beyond. In South America, the long delay before Libertadores should not mislead us. The 1948 tournament did not instantly create a yearly competition because the format was too cumbersome and the politics of continental scheduling was still difficult. But the idea survived. And when CONMEBOL finally launched the Copa de Campeones de América in 1960, soon renamed the Copa Libertadores, it was not inventing the dream from nothing. It was returning to one that Santiago had already tested. And in Europe, the effect was indirect, but real. South America's Championship of Champions entered the wider conversation about what continental club football could be. And later, Jacques Ferrand would explicitly say that South America's example helped inspire the European Cup idea. That doesn't mean a straight line from Santiago to UEFA headquarters. History is never that tidy. The Mitropa Cup mattered. The growth of post-war media mattered. The Wolves 100 moment, the one we talked about in episode 43, that mattered. But so did the fact that South America had already shown that a continental champions competition could exist, attract crowds, and carry meaning. Then there's the Di Stefano angle, which gives the story its wonderful historical echo. In 1948, he was here with River Plate, still part of the Argentine machine. Soon he would become one of the central figures in football's post-war migration of style, ideas, and prestige. Bogota first, a story in itself. Then Madrid, and we'll get to that story later this month. Then the European Cup. So when we say this tournament belongs in the prehistory of the modern club game, that is not abstract. One of the men on the pitch in Santiago would become one of the defining faces of the next era. And then there's Vasco. For Vasco, this title sits deep in the club's identity. The Expresso da Vitória was already one of the great Brazilian sides of the 1940s, but this gave the team continental scale. It became a reference point, a claim, a historical argument, and that argument mattered enough that decades later, CONMEBOL recognized the sporting achievement and historical truth of Vasco's 1948 title when allowing the club into the 1997 Super Copa Libertadores. That tells you something important. The 1948 championship may not sit in the official competition list in the same way as later Libertadores editions, but its meaning was never lost. It remained too important, too foundational, and too clearly part of the genealogy. And maybe that's the best way to understand March 14, 1948, not as a missing Libertadores final, not as a trivia answer, not as a charming prototype, but as the moment South American football demonstrated that it was ready to think continentally. One city, 7 clubs, 21 matches, a brutal format, a brilliant success, and a title won by Vasco in a tournament that showed the future long before the future acquired its permanent name. Before we go, 3 things to take away from March 14, 1948. First, the South American Championship of Champions mattered because it proved a continental club competition could work in practice and not just in theory. Second, Vasco didn't just win a tournament, they won the first South American club title with genuine continental meaning against opponents who still define the continent's football map today. And third, Libertadores didn't suddenly appear in 1960. Its roots run back through Santiago in 1948, as South America staged the rehearsal before the main production. On this day in 1948, Vasco da Gama drew 0-0 with River Plate in Santiago and secured the South American Championship of Champions, the pioneering continental club tournament that showed South America and eventually the football world what Copa Libertadores could one day become. That's all for episode 134 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Law Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with a fellow football historian. Tomorrow, we stay in the Copa Libertadores and go to March 15, 1970, when Peñarol demolished Valencia of Venezuela by 11 goals to 2, the most extreme scoreline in Libertadores history. See you tomorrow.